So I figured I'd go through in no particular order the books that really made a difference as far as business for me. And I don't consider myself a businessman naturally, like a lot of people are. And I think I struggled with a lot of the anxiety of going out on my own and starting my own company and supporting myself not through anyone else. Now, to some extent that's true. You're always going to have a boss. If it's not your immediate boss or supervisor, it's going to be your customers. And for me, I outlined the reasons for going out on my own and to start my own company in the review I did for my personal MBA book. Basically, I got sick of having someone's boot on the back of my neck. The company was ran very poorly by a guy who inherited it. And so in my late 20s, I kind of got the idea that I wanted to go on my own, start my own thing. And so I started buying business books, buying biographies, buying history books, once to just, if for no other reason, kind of lay the foundation for how I would go about it and eventually break out on my own. And the thing about books is you're always going to be able to have access to the top courses and the best mentors that are out there. For example, Richard Branson, Rockefeller, and all of those titans of businesses that came long before. They don't even have to be alive for you to learn from them. And for the job that I had, I could listen to books all day long because my job was I was very much on autopilot the whole day. So I invested heavily in audiobooks. And so in no particular order, I'll start my list. So first up, one of the first books that I got was Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now I know this one has kind of been out there for a while, and a lot of people either hate it or you like it, but there's one main point that is driven home in this book very well, very early on, is that what you don't want to do is sell hours for dollars. So I started thinking about that, and that's true. Everyone I know that is very successful, they either have investments that pay them a little bit all year long, or a lot of them, or they have an army of employees that are going out there and completing jobs, and they're just taking all the profits, which is fine if you're happy with that. But at the company I worked at, it was very clear that I was not going to be able to retire there. As soon as I was not able to physically handle the job, I would have been cut with very little savings, very little hopes of any kind of retirement. I would have been reliant on Social Security, and that just wasn't a future that I was happy with. And also this book kind of outlines some of the ins and outs of real estate, which is eventually what I ended up getting into. A lot of guys in the trades, they always think, well, when I want to retire, I'm going to get into real estate and I'm going to just collect rent. Well, that's great. That's a pipe dream because it takes time. And you're going to find online there's all kinds of people that are talking about real estate and how to get into it and how to buy property cheap and then rent it and then don't have to do anything to it, which is a complete load of crap. I have yet to see any properties, tax foreclosures or otherwise, that are turnkey properties that are affordable at a price tag where you'll actually be able to make money on it. Usually the ones that are beautiful, gorgeous, ready to go, those aren't the ones that are foreclosed on, at least not in my area. So just saying someday I'm going to get into having rentals is simply not enough. Moving on from there, my personal MBA was one that I already reviewed. And in that review, I already went over the thought process to going out on my own, the anxiety leading up to finally quitting my job. And to be honest, when I quit, I started off with a grand fortune of I think $8,000, and I had about 6 months of work lined up when I quit. And a good friend of mine gave me a little bit of advice. If you're unhappy with your job, the best time to look for another job or to develop a company is while you still have a job. Not when you're hungry, not when you're starving. Because if you wait till you're starving and you're desperate, ultimately you're probably not going to make very good decisions. So the personal MBA goes through things like imposter syndrome, like thinking that maybe I'm not, like I got away with making this much money once, but I'm probably not going to be able to carry it on because people are going to find out that I'm a fraud and that I'm not really worth this much cash, which is common. I kind of had that a little bit when I started quoting prices, and you have to kind of justify the numbers that you're quoting. And this book kind of breaks it down. Well, you got to account for insurance and all those other fun things that come with owning your own business, at least if you're going to have a legitimate business. And my very favorite part of this book is that it goes into immediately going into the workforce and earning a living versus going to a college and getting a 4-year degree. Now, I talk to people all the time about college. If you're going to go be a doctor, if you want to be a lawyer, you have to go to college. There are things that you do if you want to do, if you're passionate about, and you need to go to college, you need to learn that somewhere, that's fine. Not everything can be learned from books or going from the library like I did. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about simply making a living. And when people ask me about it, I tell them if your goal is to make a lot of money, become a master electrician or a plumber, a lot of these guys will take you straight out of high school into an apprenticeship. You'll make money while you're learning, and you'll make extremely good money when your apprenticeship is over. The electricians that I hire are giving me a friend rate of about $100 an hour. Another contractor I talked to about plumbers, they're up to $130 in the area that I live in, which is good. Now, if you live somewhere in Chicago or New York or somewhere like that, which is maybe a higher income area, higher cost of living, I can imagine it being a lot more. And the best part is you'll make that much without having a sweet $100,000 student loan bill tied to your name. Now, admittedly, these jobs do stink. I would never want to be a plumber or an electrician. When I started off, when I asked, all I did for a living was plaster. I was very good at it, but that's all I did. It was just strictly plaster. Everything from old school lath plaster to some little bit of ornamental plaster work, all the way to veneer plaster and drywall finishing if needed. So when I went on my own, it wasn't like I didn't have any skills. I was very good at making old houses that looked like crap look very good already. Before I went on my own, I had some skills. So Personal MBA is basically just an overview of just basic business. Now, this one might seem a little bit odd, but one of the books is probably directly responsible for me quitting my job and being able to afford going on my own is 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. Now, this may seem weird, but this book has a lot of points in history that it's taken from different examples. One of them happened to be a reputation. I had an outstanding reputation when I left, managing projects, getting them done on time, profitable, managing guys on site. And I was going to be doing the same thing on a big project in New York. And I remember there was a part about Christopher Columbus who asked for the moon basically when he was discovering the new world. And he asked for way more than he thought he was going to get. And he actually got it. Now, whether or not they intended on paying him is debatable. But one thing I learned from that book is ask for way more than you think. Don't cap your self-worth when you're negotiating. Because a couple things. First of all, you just might get it. And the other thing is it's a lot easier to negotiate down than up. So if you agree to do a project for $10,000, the next project you want to do it for $15,000, that's a lot harder to do than to say, I'll do it for $20,000, and they say that's too much, and then you negotiate down to $15,000. So now the client thinks that they're going to get it done for a discounted rate, but you're still making a good amount. Now that's a little bit tougher to gauge, but what happened for me is I was going to do a project in New York. It was going to be, I figured out how much it was going to cost me to do it, how much I wanted to charge. I doubled it. I thought there's no way I'm going to get this amount of money. Nobody around me makes it. I was way more than union scale in New York. So when I quoted them this number, the boss paused a little bit, thought about it, and said, you know what, that seems fair. And of course I couldn't believe it, and then the rest of the money got stored into the war chest, and the rest is history. There's also some good examples in this book about reputation. There's one guy, I think he was an emperor, and he had a reputation of setting traps for people. And it was like a walled palace that he had. And one of his scouts came back and said, your enemy is on his way with a massive army. He was caught there. He was dead. And he didn't have much time to prepare. So he told everyone to hide and open the city gates. And so they did. And he sat there and he just played, I think it was like a lute or something. And he just hung out, plain view, and waited for him. So when they got there, he had this reputation of being just a master of setting traps. He had done it before in the past. He could do it again. They couldn't see it. They were watching him. They were trying to see, where's his traps? Where's his army? I can't find their army. They did not even for a second consider that he was caught basically with his pants down. So he just hung out and bluffed. Played it cool. The attacking army eventually packed up and left. So basically he defeated them with his reputation alone. It was probably one of my favorite ones. But there's a lot of other examples in this book that I think this one rates pretty high on my must-read list. And so long as we're talking about marketing, another one that really stands out is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And this is written by a guy who does hostage negotiation for a living. So what's funny is all the principles that he talks about as far as negotiation work well in the business world as well. And one example that really worked well for me was the mirror technique. And this, for buying property, really works out because you get people that think their properties are worth a lot more than they actually are. And this only works if you're talking to the owner or the person that's actually going to make the decision to sell it to you. If you're going through realtors, it's a little bit tougher. But one technique, the mirror technique, really works well. So if you're talking to the owner, one property I bought, they're like, well, fixed up, it's going to be worth $300,000. So I'll sell it to you for $280,000. So then you say, well, so you're going to sell me this place for $280,000. I get to fix it up, which will cost about $50,000. And then you're telling me I'll be able to sell it for $300,000. And then they kind of like, once they repeat it back to you, they kind of realize how stupid that sounds, and that's a good way to negotiate them down and chew them down, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. But as far as negotiations go, this is an excellent book to anyone that's trying to negotiate a higher price for their services or product. Now, as far as marketing goes, there's really only one book that I would recommend, and that's Contagious by Jonah Berg. It's a pretty short book, but it goes into different marketing tactics that people use. A lot of it has to do with numbers. There's a lot of little nuggets in there of wisdom. For example, when you're advertising ground beef, you don't say if it's 90% beef and 10% fat, you focus on the 90% beef. You don't say this beef is only 10% fat. But it goes into other successful marketing campaigns. Apple is mentioned a lot. That's a very popular one. But if you have a shoestring budget and you need to market your product, whatever it is, on the internet, through friends, this is definitely a book you're going to want to pick up. There are others that were okay, but this one is the true rock star, in my opinion, of the ones that I've read. Another short but sweet one was The Richest Man in Babylon. It's a decent book. It's told kind of in the format of a story, but basically the idea here is to spend less than you make. Save and invest your savings. Ultimately, that's the whole book in a nutshell. It seems very simple, and it is simple, but it's a lot harder to do than it sounds. Arguably, this is probably the most important step that I took before I went out on my own. I limited my bills, and I treated my bank account like a business. I drew a certain amount of money out of my bank account every week to live on, and the rest of it sat in the accounts. And my income is extremely lumpy. Some weeks are longer, some weeks are shorter. Wintertime is brutal, summertime is extremely busy, but my income was consistent, and I tried to keep the average balance on an increase. Well, what do you do with the rest of it? Well, you invest it. And this was key to building a savings. The first $10,000 was the hardest out of all the rest of it, because when you're starting from nothing, it's just extremely hard to get any kind of a war chest set aside, and even harder to do if you're trying to support a wife or a family, which I was. So I couldn't afford to just leap out on my own without having a plan or some kind of financial cushion. Get Rich with Dividends by Mark Lichtenfield was also a highly influential book that I got. A lot of this they don't really teach you in high school. They don't teach you how to manage money in high school. There's a lot of stuff that I think is essential to being an adult that they just do not teach you. Even if you're not going to go out on your own, this is one of those books that you should get and listen to and understand intimately, if for no other reason than when you're talking to somebody about your 401k or your retirement, just so that you understand what's happening with your money. But a lot of the principles in this book also transfer into managing your business. So for me, with rental properties, I treat those rental properties like dividend accounts, your rent being the dividend. So if I don't get 10% or $100 for every $1,000 that I invest, then it's obviously not a good deal. I might as well put it in the stock market and save myself a lot of trouble. And admittedly, the stock market is pretty scary, especially now. There's a lot of volatility out there. But this book helps you understand how to benefit from that, what to invest in, and to be clear, I talked to an investment guy about this strategy, a guy that I happened to be working for at the time who was like a big money manager. He called me a dinosaur. This is kind of the old way. A lot of people now, they like to invest in sexy technology companies and all that. This book is strictly good companies, not fun companies. Companies like 3M, companies that have been around a long time, companies that pay dividends regularly. These are the companies that you want to invest in. These are the companies that you want to put money in that will continue to pay you for a long time, and it'll grow. It takes into account the ups and downs of the market, So over the long term, you end up being profitable. It's also a good principle, like I said, with exponential growth, like with property. So all of my rental income goes into the war chest and is reinvested in other properties, or possibly even the stock market if there's nothing available, so that it can grow. One thing that hammers home is that your dollar, the only financial guarantee that you're ever going to get from anyone is that your dollar that you have will be less valuable tomorrow than it is today. That is the only guarantee financially that you'll ever get from anyone. So just sticking it in a bank account, it will decay. Property, I don't necessarily think the property is getting more valuable. I think the dollar is just getting weaker over time. But either way, it's inflating along with the currency and paying you, hopefully, handsome rent along the way. And you have someone else paying off a large mortgage for you, or preferably no mortgage. I've always been a little bit more conservative that way. I don't like to be highly leveraged, but if you want to make a lot of money, leveraging it is the way to go. But I personally don't like the stress. Now, going along with this one, if you want to get a little bit more ambitious, get rich with options is also a good one. There's only one option strategy that I personally like, and that's selling covered calls. All other option strategies I'm not interested in because they're just too risky, with the exception of maybe selling puts. But this book, one thing that it's funny that it stresses is if you're going to sell puts, there is no difference in terms of risk in buying a stock outright or selling a put on that stock if it's a company that you want to buy anyways. Never, ever, ever, ever do that on a company that you don't intend to buy. So if it doesn't fill, if the contract doesn't go through, then you make money on it. But if it does fill, then you're getting it at a discount. So if a company is too expensive, selling puts on it is a good way to make money on it without actually owning it. So that's an excellent strategy. Selling covered calls, also an outstanding strategy. You get the dividend, you get a little bit of appreciation, and you get your premium for selling the covered calls. Now that one you got to be a little bit more careful on because stocks can get called away. These books outline that. But in my opinion, if you're going to trade stock, don't touch it until you read Get Rich with Dividends first. Get Rich with Options is okay, but Get Rich with Dividends also covers those strategies. A little bit more briefly though. Now, like I said, you can get some really good mentors through books. Anyone can have access to these people, whether it's through the library or like me, I listen to them at work, so I get paid to learn. And Richard Branson has a whole collection of books that he's done. I think I got them all. But basically his approach to business, well, he likes to have a lot of fun, obviously, but also with his companies, he likes to keep things small, keep things simple. Small is beautiful. So even his airlines, when they get too big, like Virgin Air, he breaks them up. So you have Virgin US, Virgin Atlantic, so on and so forth, just so that they're more efficiently ran. Another point that he brought out, there's one of his books, he goes up against Coca-Cola. So he tried to take down a giant with Coca-Cola, and he failed miserably. What he did is he poked a sleeping giant by his tactics with a tank in Central Park and then shooting a cannon at the Coca-Cola sign to try to get attention. Well, he did get attention, but he got the wrong kind of attention. He got attention from Coke. They took it personally, and they set up a Virgin Cola task force to just stomp him out of existence. And the lesson he learned is it's okay to take on titans, but not if your product isn't substantially better than your competitor. So for me, doing rentals isn't exactly new. People have been doing it for a long time. But in my area, specifically, I don't think anyone set a very high bar. And like I said, I was very good at making old buildings look very nice and able to do it cost effective. So for me, to take a piece of crap property and turn it into a really nice rental is something that my competition doesn't do. So my properties tend to rent immediately, and a lot of that is done on reputation, a lot of word of mouth. So sometimes they're even rented before they're even completed. Now, moving forward, obviously biographies are a big key and a good place to learn. Probably first and foremost as far as investments go is The Snowball, and that's obviously Warren Buffett's biography. Now, the thing about biographies and business titans like Warren Buffett is you hear that name and you automatically associate it with success in investing. A lot of people like to refer to him as the Oracle. Well, he didn't start off that way. So you see the destination and you don't necessarily see the journey. With The Snowball, it was really good because he started off pretty humble. And so you get to see the progression of him starting off with nothing and going from there to where he is today. And one thing he likes to do is invest in a lot of dividend stocks that are going to appreciate and pay out, which is good instead of to invest in a company. And he liked exponential growth. So again, applying that with business today as far as rental properties go, like I said with the dividends, you reinvest your earnings as best you can and watch it grow. Titan by Ron Chernow is also a good one about John Rockefeller's biography. Now, when you think of Rockefeller, you think of Rockefeller Plaza, you think of Standard Oil, all the companies that he created, you think of the destination. This is another good one because he also had very humble beginnings and was able to create a massive company in his lifetime. But again, one of his nicknames was the octopus. He had fingers everywhere, companies everywhere. Once it was set up, he let them run, he let them grow, didn't micromanage them. And it was interesting watching him dodge politicians trying to break up his company, which I think is applicable to today, and watching the governments today and what they do and how they affect business. He was able to react to their tactics and was able to move forward. And he lived through a lot of interesting times. And after reading that book, I got a book called The Forgotten Man, which goes through the environment around the Great Depression. And I read these books when we were going through some hard times in the economy. And one of my favorite sayings of all is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And it's funny because you read a book like The Forgotten Man and you see a lot of the same stuff happening today. Maybe not on as big of a scale, but like for example, 2008 happened. It was a correction, which was very similar to the Great Depression. Money supply tightened up. Governments tried to correct it. They didn't just let it, allow it to happen, allow the correction to happen. They tried to prevent it. They ended up delaying it with their government programs. Cash for clunkers being one that comes to mind. But there was a lot of programs and incentives and things that the governments did back then that delayed the Great Depression. So the big money, the companies driving the economy, they just sat on the sidelines and just waited to see what was going to happen, which is what happened in 2008. And I think we're kind of heading into some financial uncertainties. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again sometime soon. Another thing that is struck home by The Forgotten Man that I thought was kind of funny is that there is nothing more fragile in this world than the egos of powerful men. And around that time, the private sector companies back then were starting to get a lot of power. That was the birth of the skyscraper. So Washington obviously didn't like that. They went through a period where they were concerned that the companies were getting more power than the government was. And so DC put a cap on buildings so that they couldn't be taller than the Capitol. They wanted the Capitol to be the tallest building around. No buildings around that area could be taller than any government property, because they were afraid they were going to be overshadowed. I thought it was pretty petty, but it makes sense. Like I said, powerful men's egos, extremely fragile. And I think that rings truer today than it did back then. And the funny thing is, this might be a little bit unrelated, but it reminds me of when the plague in Europe was going around. This is a little bit unrelated, but there was also a very similar struggle between the church and the state on who had the higher authority. So you kind of started to see a struggle between businesses and the government back then. So now today you're starting to see the government implement programs like no evictions. That's one that strikes close to home. Economy is circling the toilet drain, and so they have this blanket order where you can't evict tenants that aren't paying. So is it exactly the same as back in the 20s and 30s? Not really, but it is very close. And that affects smaller businesses like mine, not necessarily big Titan companies like Standard Oil. And there are a lot of good books and memoirs out there. One of them that was a little bit colorful was Hughes, about Howard Hughes and his start. Now, he inherited a big company. One thing that was pretty interesting about that is his company was drill bits. And the drill bits were extremely important because they were able to drill through solid granite and access oil that they knew was deeper, but they didn't have anything that could shoot through the granite. And so his dad invented a drill bit that was able to allow these companies to access bigger oil reserves. And that's all fine and dandy, but what I think is funny is that he never sold them. He only rented the drill bits. So again, you're going to start to see a pattern here. These companies set up ways to generate cash flow, and then they move on. Of course, then Howard Hughes went crazy, and the movie about his life, when he starts to lose his mind after he built that wood airplane, that's just when he starts to go crazy. He gets really crazy. And there's also a lot of examples that I could quote from for business. Another one was The Jobs Book by Walter Isaacson. Probably one of my top 5 nonfiction books as far as starting from nothing and building a fantastic company. And with the Jobs book, it's funny because he starts off just a complete arrogant cuss. Don't really like him, but then the way Walter Isaacson writes it, after he's kicked out from Apple, he starts Pixar. He comes back, he's still an arrogant cuss, but you still kind of like him. That could be Walter Isaacson's writing style, but still an extremely good book. Also a surprising one was Total Recall by Arnold Schwarzenegger. After reading that one, I cannot look at him and view him as an actor. Now he just is the businessman, in my opinion. Again, setting up rental properties, trying different things, not afraid to fail. Hates the word lucky. People say, oh, you just got lucky. Not really. Not with those guys. Not with him, not with Richard Branson. They were just willing to try almost anything. Not afraid of failure. Learn from their failure and move on. Another one that was really interesting was The Power of Mathematical Thinking. This one was one that was not one that's going to be super entertaining, but will change the way you look at things. It makes you look at like news reports when they're talking about, well, for example, the pandemic that we're all going through now. It makes you look at the numbers and really see past them. This book, if nothing else, stresses that you can take the same numbers and argue either side of a point. For example, if you have a county that is reporting less cases of coronavirus, you can report on it and say that there's less cases of coronaviruses because all the things that we're putting in place are working. Less people are getting sick. Or you could take the same numbers and say there's less cases of coronavirus because it was so bad before that everyone has had it, and now everyone in the county has had it. We're not reporting any more cases because we ran out of people to infect. So, in short, this book just makes it so you can see a little bit past the numbers and not just take them at face value. Another good one was Blue Fishing by Steve Sims. Kind of a short book, kind of fun, a little bit of insight on how to manage people, how to make them feel important and keep coming back, how to work with people. If this is something you struggle with, this is definitely a book you should get into. Not the most in-depth as far as business goes, but this is definitely an example of a guy who has a very natural way about just making money. Also, American Icon by Bryce G. Hoffman is another one that I recommend just to see how government can influence business. This one takes place during the 2008 financial crisis and just the environment with the automakers. A lot of them were failing. A lot of them should have failed. They were just terrible ran businesses, Ford among them. But we all remember Too Big to Fail. Ford, I think, is the only company that did not take government money to stay alive. They were able to make necessary changes and business decisions to save the company on their own, and it outlines how they were able to overcome those challenges. Whereas the other automakers didn't necessarily need to make those cuts, just business as usual, and then they take a bailout. Now, there are lots of reasons why you should read books like that. Part of it is because if you're going to invest in companies, you want to be able to invest in companies that are able to make those tough choices and not reliant on government involvement to pay their dividends. That being said, Ford did cut their dividends, and if you read How to Get Rich with Dividends, then you'll know that that's a company that you should invest in. There are obviously other books that stood out. This is just a quick overview of some of the most influential ones, and just a quick overview of books that I read leading up to me quitting my job and going out on my own. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you've read these books. Next one will be a real-world look at a property that I got and the process to turn it around. I'll talk to you next time.